The smoke from Leonhard Kurtz's chimney rose in a thin column through the December air, barely thicker than a candle's breath, while his neighbors, a mile downslope, burned through firewood with the desperation of men trying to heat the wilderness itself. Inside his 5-tiered hillside structure, each level glowed with warmth rising from a single fire at the base, the top chamber so hot that Leonhard slept without blankets while outside temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale might just change how you think about survival itself. The winter of 1842 arrived in Montana Territory with a cruelty that old-timers said they hadn't seen in 20 years. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero in early November and stayed there. By December, the cold had settled into something beyond mere weather. It became a presence that tested every structure, every supply cache, every decision men had made during warmer months. Leonhard Kurtz and Johann Voigt had built their cabin the previous spring using methods every trapper in the territory understood. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and mud, a single room measuring 12 feet by 14 feet with one door and one small window. They had built it in 5 days. It kept out wind and rain. That had seemed sufficient. The cabin stood in a clearing near a creek that fed into the Yellowstone River. The structure sat on flat ground with 4 walls exposed to the elements, standard practice that no one questioned. Johann had been Leonhardt's partner for 3 seasons. A German immigrant like Leonhardt himself, Johann had come west in 1838 seeking freedom and profit in beaver pelts. He was competent with traps, reliable on the trail, and careful with supplies. The firewood consumption began to concern Leonhardt in mid-December. They were burning through wood at a rate that would deplete their stockpile before spring. The interior temperature hovered around 45 degrees despite the fire burning constantly. Their breath formed clouds when they spoke. Johann had shrugged. Every cabin burns wood in winter. This is how it works. But Leonhardt couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. They were feeding heat into a structure that bled warmth in every direction. The logs conducted cold from outside. Gaps in the chinking allowed drafts. Heat escaped through the roof despite thick sod covering. They were fighting the wilderness itself, trying to create warmth in an environment designed to destroy it. On January 8, 1843, Johann went to check their trapline alone. Leonhardt stayed at the cabin to split more firewood. The temperature that morning was 22 below zero. Johann dressed in every layer he owned: wool underlayers, leather outer garments, a heavy elk hide coat, thick mittens, and a fur hat. He never returned. Leonhardt found him 4 hours later, collapsed beside a frozen beaver pond half a mile from the cabin. Sustained exposure to 22 below had overwhelmed Johann's ability to generate heat. He had likely felt tired, then confused, then simply sat down to rest. Leonhardt carried Johann's body back and buried him 2 days later, when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in the cabin, burning wood to maintain a temperature that barely kept water from freezing. He understood something that night that would change everything. Johann hadn't died from lack of clothing or poor judgment. He had died because their entire approach to surviving winter was mathematically unsustainable. They were burning enormous quantities of wood to fight heat loss through 4 exposed walls, a roof, a door, and a window. Most men would have grieved and moved on. Leonhardt became obsessed with a single question: what if there was a better way? Leonhardt finished the trapping season alone, working Johann's lines in addition to his own. The work kept his hands occupied, but his mind returned constantly to the problem of heat. Every evening when he returned to the cabin, he fed the fire and watched how quickly warmth disappeared into the winter air. He began keeping records. Each morning he counted the split logs he'd burned overnight. Each afternoon he estimated the interior temperature by observing how quickly water froze in a tin cup placed at various distances from the fire. The numbers told a story of inefficiency that bordered on madness. A standard winter night required 16 to 20 split logs to maintain a barely survivable interior temperature. Multiply that by the 150 nights between November and April, and the mathematics became brutal. 3,000 logs minimum. Each log represented time spent cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking. More. Importantly, each log represented a unit of heat that his cabin design allowed to escape almost as quickly as it was generated. Leonhardt studied the fire itself with new attention. Heat rose from the flames in a visible column, traveling straight up toward the roof. It didn't spread sideways, it didn't sink downward. It rose, following some fundamental principle of nature that Leonhardt had observed his entire life without truly considering its implications. Smoke behaved the same way. It went up through the chimney, never down, never sideways, unless wind forced it. The hottest air in the cabin gathered near the ceiling, while cold air settled near the floor. This wasn't random. This was consistent, predictable, a law as reliable as water flowing downhill. Yet the cabin he and Johann had built ignored this law entirely. The structure was designed as if heat spread uniformly in all directions, as if warming four walls equally made sense. They had built a box with 4 exposed sides, and wondered why they couldn't keep it warm. Leonhardt examined each source of heat loss methodically. The walls themselves conducted cold from outside. When he placed his hand on the interior logs during bitter nights, they felt ice cold, despite the fire burning 10 feet away. The gaps between logs leaked drafts constantly. The door, however well fitted, couldn't seal completely against its frame. The rawhide window covering provided almost no insulation. The roof, despite its sod layer, allowed heat to escape upward into the night sky. He calculated that perhaps 1/5 of the heat his fire generated actually warmed the living space. The rest escaped through walls, roof, gaps, and openings. He was burning 4 logs to get the warming effect of 1. Other trappers accepted this as simply how mountain winters worked. You cut more wood, you burned more wood, you survived, or you didn't. Leonhardt couldn't accept it. Johann's death had made acceptance impossible. There had to be a way. To work with heat's nature instead of fighting it. There had to be a way to trap heat where it wanted to go instead of forcing it where it didn't. The question wasn't whether such a method existed. The question was whether Leonhardt could discover it before another winter killed someone else. Spring arrived in late April, turning the snow to mud and opening the creeks to flowing water again. Leonhardt sold his furs in the small trading post at the confluence of 2 rivers, collecting enough money to survive another year. Other trappers headed to St. Louis or deeper into the mountains. Leonhardt stayed in the territory with a specific purpose. He began exploring every underground space he could find. Abandoned mine shafts, natural caves, root cellars dug by settlers who'd given up and moved on. He carried a simple thermometer he'd purchased at the trading post, a glass tube with mercury that rose and fell with temperature changes. The pattern he discovered was consistent and remarkable. Surface temperatures in May varied wildly, freezing at night, 70 degrees by afternoon. But 20 feet underground, every space maintained roughly the same temperature, 52 to 55 degrees. It didn't matter if the day was hot or cold. The earth itself stayed constant. Leonhardt found a mine shaft that went 40 feet into a hillside. At the entrance, temperature matched the outside air. 20 feet in, it was 54 degrees. At the back of the shaft, 40 feet deep, it was 54 degrees. He returned at dawn when surface temperature was 35 degrees. The mine interior remained 54 degrees. He visited a root cellar built by a homesteader who'd abandoned it 3 years prior. The cellar was 8 feet deep, carved into a south-facing slope. In the heat of afternoon, Leonhardt climbed down and felt immediate coolness. His thermometer read 53 degrees. The earth wasn't just blocking heat, it was storing it, holding a consistent temperature regardless of surface conditions. This was the principle he'd been searching for. Earth acted as thermal mass, a battery that maintained stable temperature. In winter, when surface air dropped to 20 below, the Earth, 20 feet down, remained at 50-something degrees. That was still cold by human comfort standards, but it was 70 degrees warmer than the outside air. A cabin built into Earth wouldn't have to fight the full temperature differential between inside and outside. It would only need to bridge the gap between Earth temperature and comfort temperature. Instead of heating 70 degrees of difference, you'd heat 15 or 20 degrees. Leonhardt spent 3 weeks visiting every underground space within 20 miles. He measured, recorded, observed. The deeper into Earth, the more stable the temperature. The more Earth contact a space had, the less it responded to surface weather changes. He began to understand that his cabin's 4 exposed walls weren't just a design flaw. They were the fundamental mistake. Every wall exposed to air was a wall fighting the full force of winter. Every wall buried in Earth was a wall protected by nature's own thermal battery. The question was how to build a structure that maximized Earth contact while remaining livable. In early June, Leonhardt encountered a traveling hunter named Marcus Webb at the trading post. Webb mentioned surviving an unexpected late spring blizzard by digging into a snowbank. The comment was casual, just another survival story trappers shared, but something in the details caught Leonhardt's attention. He found Webb 3 days later and asked him to explain exactly what had happened. Webb seemed puzzled by the intensity of Leonhardt's questions, but shared the full account. He'd been caught in high country when the storm hit, temperatures dropping to 15 below, with wind that made travel impossible. No trees for shelter, no time to build anything. Webb had used his knife to hollow out a space in a deep snowdrift, crawling inside and sealing the entrance with packed snow except for a small air hole. He'd expected to endure the cold until the storm passed. Instead, he'd found the interior surprisingly comfortable, not warm, but vastly warmer than outside. He'd actually slept without shivering. Leonhardt pressed for details. How large was the space? How thick were the walls? What was the temperature difference? Webb couldn't answer precisely, but he estimated the interior felt 30 degrees warmer than the howling wind outside. The walls were perhaps 2 feet thick. The space was barely large enough for a man to lie down. This matched principles Leonhardt had observed in his Earth studies, but applied to a different material. Snow wasn't solid ice, it was ice crystals with air trapped between them. Those air pockets acted as insulation, the same principle that made wool clothing warm. Air itself was an insulator when trapped and prevented from moving. Leonhardt realized that the best natural shelters all shared common elements. They minimized surface area exposed to weather. They used materials with insulating properties, earth, snow, anything that trapped air. They were small enough that body heat alone could warm them. They worked with natural materials instead of fighting them. He began thinking about combinations. What if you built into Earth like a mine shaft, but created livable space? What if you used Earth's stable temperature as a foundation and added heat strategically? What if you stopped thinking about cabins as boxes sitting on ground and started thinking about them as spaces carved into the ground itself? The concept forming in his mind didn't match anything he'd seen in the territory. It would require digging, not just building. It would look strange, possibly absurd. Other trappers would think he'd lost his mind, but the physics made sense. Earth provided thermal mass and insulation. Snow proved that trapped air was nature's own insulation. Heat naturally rose, so why not stack spaces vertically and let heat climb naturally? By late June, Leonhardt had filled a small notebook with sketches and calculations. He hadn't solved every problem, but he'd identified the core principles. Now he needed to test them. Leonhardt returned to the area where he'd trapped with Johann and began telling other trappers about his plan. He didn't keep it secret, partly because he saw no reason to, partly because he wanted to gauge reactions and identify potential flaws in his thinking. The reactions were immediate and uniform. Men thought he was joking at first. When they realized he was serious, the mockery began. Ulrich Kessler, an elder trapper who'd survived 15 winters in the mountains, listened to Leonhardt's explanation with increasing disbelief. "You want to dig 5 rooms into a hillside and stack them like cordwood? That's not a cabin, boy, that's a grave with windows." Bruno Lang, a rival trapper, who competed with Leonhardt for the best beaver ponds, laughed openly. "Johann's death affected your mind. A man needs to build on flat ground, not crawl into hills like a badger. You'll dig all summer and freeze all winter in your fancy tunnel." Otto Zimmermann, who'd built more cabins than any man in the territory, was less cruel but equally dismissive. "I've built 17 cabins using methods that work. Notched logs, flat ground, 4 walls, 1 roof. That's how it's done. You're wasting time and effort on ideas that ignore generations of proven practice." The criticism followed predictable patterns. Building into earth was unstable. The hillside would collapse. Multiple rooms meant multiple problems. Too complex, too much could go wrong. Vertical space was useless. Heat wouldn't distribute properly. The effort required was absurd. Why spend all summer building when a proper cabin took 5 days? Leonhardt listened to each objection and responded with his observations about earth temperature, thermal mass, and convection. The responses ranged from polite skepticism to outright ridicule. Several trappers made wagers that Leonhardt would abandon the project by August. Bruno Lang offered to build him a real cabin after his hillside experiment collapsed. The nickname started within a week. Men began calling the unconstructed structure Kurtz's staircase, a cabin that went up instead of out, stairs to nowhere, a monument to stubborn foolishness. Some called Leonhardt the Hill Mole. Others simply shook their heads and changed the subject when his project came up. Otto Zimmermann's refusal to help stung more than the mockery. Leonhardt had hoped the experienced builder might see merit in the design, or at least offer technical advice. Instead, Otto made clear that he wanted no association with what he considered a doomed experiment. "When you're ready to build properly, come find me. Until then, you're on your own." Leonhardt was indeed on his own. No partners, no helpers, no support from the community that had once accepted him. Just a notebook full of calculations and a hillside, waiting to prove whether he was an innovator or a fool. Leonhardt spent 2 weeks in July examining potential sites. He needed specific conditions that most trappers would never consider important. The hillside had to face south to capture maximum sunlight during winter months. The slope needed to be steep enough to create distinct levels, but not so steep that construction became impossible. Soil composition mattered. Dense clay would hold heat better than loose sand or gravel. He found the ideal location 3 miles from where his old cabin had stood, a 40-degree slope rising from a small creek, facing almost due south. He dug test holes at various points, finding dense clay mixed with small rocks beginning 18 inches below the surface. The hillside had good drainage. Water wouldn't pool and freeze inside his structure. Scattered pines provided building materials without completely clearing the area. The location had drawbacks that any conventional builder would consider disqualifying. It was 40 yards uphill from the creek, making water hauling more difficult. The slope made material transport challenging. Every log would need to be dragged uphill. Flat ground existed 50 yards away where a normal cabin could be built in a fraction of the time. Leonhardt chose the slope anyway. His design required the slope. Everything he'd learned about earth temperature, thermal mass, and vertical heat distribution depended on building into the hillside, not on it. He began by marking 5 levels ascending the slope. Each level would sit 8 feet higher than the one below, creating a stepped pattern. The bottom level started 20 feet from the base of the hill, where the slope began its steep climb. Each subsequent level was carved directly into the hillside, 10 feet back from the level below. Other trappers occasionally passed by and watched him work. They saw a man digging into a hill with a shovel, creating flat terraces that served no obvious purpose. The mockery evolved from words into simple head shaking. Men would watch for a few minutes, say nothing, and ride on. Leonhardt worked alone through July's heat. He excavated the bottom terrace first, creating a flat platform 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep. Then he began digging into the hillside behind it, carving out the space that would become his second level. The work was brutally hard. Clay and rocks resisted the shovel. Each level required removing hundreds of pounds of earth. He developed a system. Dig and loosen earth in the morning when temperatures were coolest. Haul excavated material in buckets to build up the front edge of each terrace, creating a level platform. Rest during afternoon heat. Work again in evening. Each level took 5 days to excavate to the depth he needed, 6 feet into the hillside. By early August, he had 5 terraced platforms carved into the slope, each one 8 feet higher than the last. From a distance, the hillside looked like giant stairs leading nowhere. Bruno Lang rode past one morning, studied the terraces, and shouted up the hill, "Building a staircase to heaven, Kurtz? You'll need to dig higher." Leonhardt didn't respond. He began cutting logs for the construction phase. The foundation work revealed the core difference between Leonhardt's design and traditional construction. A normal cabin required minimal foundation, perhaps some flat stones under corner logs to prevent ground contact and rot. Leonhardt's structure required foundations that would support earth pressure from 3 sides while allowing thermal contact. He started at the bottom level. The back wall would be pure earth, the hillside itself. The 2 side walls would be half earth, half log. Only the front wall would be entirely exposed to air. This meant his foundations needed to handle asymmetric forces that conventional cabins never faced. Leonhardt gathered flat stones from the creek bed, selecting pieces that could be fitted together tightly. He built a stone foundation along the front edge of the bottom terrace, creating a level base 18 inches high. This foundation served multiple purposes. It raised the log wall above ground moisture. It created a thermal break between earth and wood. Most importantly, it provided a solid anchor point for the front wall that would need to resist earth pressure pushing from behind. For the side walls, he built shorter stone foundations that transitioned from full height at the front to nothing at the back where logs would rest directly against earth. This created a gradual connection between the freestanding front wall and the earth-supported rear wall. The 2nd through 5th levels required different foundation approaches. Because these levels were carved into the hillside, the floor of each chamber was literally earth. Leonhardt covered the earth floors with flat stones, creating a surface that could be kept clean while maintaining thermal contact with the ground. He left no air gap between floor stones and earth. He wanted heat transfer, not insulation. Each level's front wall needed substantial foundation because it would support not just the wall itself, but also the earth pressing from behind. Leonhardt built stone foundations 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. He selected the largest, flattest stones for these foundations, fitting them together with minimal gaps. The work took 3 weeks. Other builders would have considered this obsessive. Most cabins sat on minimal foundation or none at all. Leonhardt was building stone foundations that would support a courthouse. But he understood that his design placed forces on the structure that normal cabins never experienced. The hillside wanted to push forward. His foundations needed to push back. By late August, he had 5 terraced levels, with solid stone foundations ready for log construction. The foundations alone represented more work than most trappers invested in an entire cabin. Ulrich Kessler rode past during the final week and studied the stonework for several minutes before speaking. "That's fine foundation work, Kurtz. Shame you're wasting it on this fool project." Leonhardt thanked him for the compliment and continued working. The foundations were ready. Now came the real construction. The bottom level was the simplest to construct and the most critical to the entire system. This chamber would house the fireplace, the single heat source that would need to warm 5 separate levels. Leonhardt understood that if this level failed, everything above it would fail as well. He selected logs with obsessive care. Each needed to be straight, roughly 12 inches in diameter, and long enough to span the 14-foot width of the chamber. He rejected logs with significant taper or irregular shapes. Other trappers used whatever trees were convenient. Leonhardt cut specific trees based on size and straightness, then hauled them uphill. The front wall went up using traditional notched corner construction. He couldn't avoid this entirely. The front wall needed to be freestanding and strong. But he modified the standard technique. Where most builders left rough notches, Leonhardt shaped each notch carefully so logs fit tightly with minimal gaps. He used no chinking on the front wall yet. That would come later. The side walls were where his design diverged completely from tradition. He built them only halfway across the chamber's width. The front 7 feet used stacked logs. The rear 7 feet was pure earth, the hillside itself. The transition point between logs and earth required careful work. Leonhardt shaped the rear end of each side wall log to fit flush against the earth, creating a smooth connection. The rear wall didn't exist in the conventional sense. It was simply the carved hillside. Face. Leonhardt smoothed it with a shovel, removing loose rocks and creating a relatively flat surface. He didn't seal it or cover it. The exposed clay would act as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day, radiating it back at night. The ceiling structure received the most attention. This ceiling would also serve as the floor for the level above, and it needed to transfer heat upward while supporting weight. Leonhardt laid thick poles across the width of the chamber, spacing them 12 inches apart. Across these poles he placed split planks, fitting them tightly together. Over the planks he spread a layer of clay 6 inches thick. The clay would conduct heat while providing a solid floor for the second level. But before sealing the ceiling completely, Leonhardt installed a feature that Otto Zimmermann would have considered insane. Near the rear wall, he created a vertical channel through the ceiling, essentially a hole 18 inches square lined with clay-covered planks. This channel would allow heat to rise directly from the first level to the second. The fireplace took another week to build. Leonhardt gathered flat stones and built a proper firebox with a narrow chimney that extended through all 5 levels and emerged from the hillside above the top chamber. The chimney was deliberately narrow, only 8 inches wide. He wanted it to create strong draft while minimizing heat loss through the chimney itself. By mid-September, the first level was complete. A chamber 14 feet wide, 12 feet deep, with 1 open wall and 3 walls of either log or earth. The vertical channel gaped in the ceiling like an open mouth, ready to feed heat upward. Leonhardt built a small fire to test the draft. Smoke rose cleanly through the chimney. Heat began to warm the chamber. Everything worked as he'd calculated. Now came the challenge of building 4 more levels above this foundation. The second level required solving a problem no frontier builder had faced: how to create a floor that would support human weight while allowing heat to flow upward. Traditional cabin construction never considered this because traditional cabins were single-story structures. Leonhardt was building something unprecedented. He began by extending the vertical channel from the first level. The 18-inch square opening needed to continue through all 5 levels, creating a continuous shaft from bottom to top. This shaft would act as a chimney for heat, not smoke, which went up the narrow stone chimney, but for the hot air itself. The second level's floor had been partially created when he built the first level's ceiling. Now he needed to complete the chamber around that floor. The technique was similar to the first level, but adapted for its position deeper into the hillside. The front wall was log construction, but shorter, only 6 feet high, because the chamber sat 8 feet higher on the slope and needed less elevation. The side walls were mostly earth with just the front 3 feet built from logs. The rear wall was entirely hillside. Leonhardt carved the earth walls smooth and left them exposed. He wanted maximum thermal contact. The clay would absorb heat and hold it. At night, when the fire burned low, the walls would radiate stored warmth back into the chamber. The ceiling construction followed the first level's pattern: poles, planks, clay layer. But Leonhardt added a refinement. He built the clay layer thicker on this level, 8 inches instead of 6. The additional mass would store more heat. He positioned another vertical channel near the rear wall, creating a continuation of the heat shaft. The channel design was critical. Too large and heat would rise too quickly, not warming the lower levels adequately. Too small and heat would be trapped, not reaching upper levels. Leonhardt had calculated 18 inches square based on principles he'd observed in mine shaft ventilation. Air needed space to move, but not so. Much space that it moved wastefully. He tested the system as he built. With a fire in the first level and the second level partially complete, he climbed up and felt the air near the vertical channel. Warm air flowed steadily upward. He held his hand 12 inches from the channel, noticeably warmer, 24 inches away, slightly warm. Across the chamber near the front wall, cool. The heat was rising but not spreading horizontally as much as he'd hoped. This concerned him briefly until he realized the earth walls weren't yet working. They needed time to absorb heat, to charge like the thermal battery he'd envisioned. He continued building. The third level followed the same pattern, carved into hillside, log front wall, tall earth sides and rear, clay floor, vertical channel. Each level sat deeper into the slope. Each level had more earth contact and less exposed wall surface. The progression was deliberate. The highest levels would be most insulated, benefiting from maximum earth. Protection. By early October, 3 levels were complete. Leonhardt could stand at the bottom and look up through the vertical channels, seeing daylight from the top of the third level. The structure was beginning to function as a system rather than isolated chambers. He lit a fire in the bottom level and waited. Within 2 hours, all 3 levels showed temperature increase. The effect was modest, perhaps 5 degrees difference between levels, but it proved the concept worked. The final 2 levels would complete the system. The 4th level represented a transition point in Leonhardt's design. The lower 3 levels were partially exposed, with substantial log walls facing outward. The 4th level was almost entirely buried in the hillside. Only a small front wall remained exposed, perhaps 4 feet of log construction with a south-facing window 18 inches square. Leonhardt carved this chamber deeper into the hillside than the others. The excavation went 10 feet back into the earth compared to 6 feet for lower levels. He wanted maximum earth contact on all sides. The chamber dimensions were smaller too, 10 feet wide instead of 12. Less interior space meant less volume to heat. The earth surrounding this chamber was now substantial. 6 feet of hillside above, 10 feet behind, and several feet on each side. Leonhardt calculated that roughly 800 cubic feet of clay and rock surrounded this level. That mass would take days to warm up, but once warm, it would hold heat like a massive stone oven. He built the floor with special attention. The clay layer was 12 inches thick, double the thickness of lower levels. He embedded flat stones in the clay, creating a walking surface that wouldn't turn to mud, but would still conduct heat efficiently. The vertical channel continued through, maintaining its 18-inch square dimensions. The 5th and highest level was the smallest and most deeply buried chamber in the structure. Leonhardt carved it 8 feet back into the hillside, creating a space barely 10 feet wide and 8 feet deep. A single small window faced south, the only opening to the outside world. The chamber was essentially a cave with one glass-covered hole for light. The ceiling of this chamber required different treatment. It was the top of the system. Heat would rise here and have nowhere else to go. Leonhardt sealed the ceiling with thick clay, then piled earth over it. He covered the earth with cut sod, creating a living roof that would provide additional insulation. Snow would accumulate here in winter, adding more insulation when it was most needed. The vertical channel ended in this chamber. Heat rising from below would exhaust into this space, warming it more than any other level. Leonhardt carved ventilation holes near the ceiling, small openings that led to the outside, allowing moisture to escape while retaining most of the heat. He built a sleeping platform in the 5th level, raising it 2 feet off the floor. Heat would stratify in this chamber, hottest near the ceiling, cooler near the floor. A raised sleeping platform would put him in the warmest zone. The construction was complete by late October. 5 levels stacked up a hillside, connected by vertical channels surrounded by earth. From the front, the structure looked like a series of stacked boxes, each one smaller and more recessed than the one below. Otto Zimmermann visited during the final week of construction. He walked around the structure slowly, studying the logwork, examining the foundations. His expression was unreadable. "It's well built," he finally said. "Good logwork, solid foundations, but it's still 5 rooms stacked in a hill. Come winter, you'll understand why we build on flat ground." Leonhardt thanked him and continued working. The structure was built. Now came the moment of truth. With the structure complete, Leonhardt turned his attention to sealing gaps and creating the thermal envelope that would make the system work. Traditional chinking used moss or mud pressed between logs. It worked adequately for normal cabins but cracked over time as moisture froze and thawed. Leonhardt needed something more durable. He spent a week developing a mixture that combined 3 materials. The base was clay dug from the hillside, the same dense clay that surrounded his chambers. He dried it, powdered it, then mixed it with water to create a thick paste. To this he added dried grass, cut from the meadow below. The grass fibers were 6 to 8 inches long, and he mixed them thoroughly into the clay. The grass served the same purpose that horsehair served in plaster. It reinforced the clay, preventing cracks from spreading. A crack that started in one section would hit a grass fiber and stop, rather than propagating through the entire chinking layer. The third ingredient was pine pitch. He collected sap from damaged pine trees, boiled it down in a pot over his fire until it defied, reduced to a sticky resin. When he mixed this resin into the clay and grass mixture, it created something remarkable. The pitch made the mixture slightly elastic and completely waterproof. It also gave the chinking adhesive properties that helped it bond to the logs. The mixture was difficult to work with. It had to be applied while still warm and pliable. Leonhardt worked in small batches, mixing clay, grass, and pitch, then immediately pressing it into the gaps between logs before it cooled and hardened. He used a flat stick to pack it tightly, ensuring no air gaps remained. The front walls received the most attention. These were the only walls fully exposed to weather and wind. Leonhardt applied his mixture in layers, building up a seal that was 2 inches thick in places. He worked it into every gap, every crack, every space where air might penetrate. The transition points between logs and earth received special treatment. Where log walls met hillside, moisture could accumulate and cause rot. Leonhardt packed these junctions with extra thickness of his mixture, creating a waterproof seal that would protect the wood while maintaining thermal contact with the earth. He also applied the mixture to the exposed earth walls inside the chambers. A thin layer over the clay hillside, just enough to create a hard surface that wouldn't crumble or create dust, but not so much that it would insulate and prevent thermal transfer. Otto Zimmermann visited again while Leonhardt was applying chinking to the 3rd level. He watched for several minutes, then climbed up and examined the mixture closely. He pressed a thumb against dried chinking from a lower level, testing its hardness. "That's not standard mud," Otto observed. "What's in it?" Leonhardt explained his mixture. Otto listened, nodded slowly, then offered his assessment. "It'll crack by spring. Pine pitch makes it too rigid. When logs settle and shift, rigid chinking fails." Leonhardt disagreed but didn't argue. He believed the grass fibers would allow enough flexibility, while the pitch provided durability. By mid-November, every gap was sealed. The structure was as weather-tight as Leonhardt could make it. Windows were covered with oiled canvas stretched over wooden frames. The door at the bottom level was heavy planks fitted tightly. Everything was ready for winter's test. Leonhardt moved his supplies into the structure in late November. He distributed items across the 5 levels, based on use and temperature requirements. The bottom level became storage for items that benefited from cool temperatures: meat, preserved foods, things that would spoil in warmth. The second level held tools and equipment. The third level became his primary living space with a small table and chair. The fourth level stored clothing and personal items. The fifth level was sleeping quarters. He lit his first fire on November 23rd. A modest fire, just enough to test the system and begin warming the thermal mass. He used split pine, letting it burn steadily while he moved between levels, observing how heat distributed. The results in the first few days were disappointing. The bottom level warmed quickly. The chamber near the fire reached comfortable temperatures within an hour, but the upper levels remained cold. The second level showed slight warming. The third level was barely affected. The fourth and fifth levels stayed cold as the outside air. Leonhardt had expected this. The earth surrounding his chambers had absorbed summer heat and was still relatively warm, perhaps 50 degrees throughout the hillside. His structure wasn't yet creating a strong temperature gradient because the baseline temperature of the earth itself was masking the effect. The system needed true winter cold to function as designed. He recorded temperatures twice daily using his mercury thermometer: bottom level, 58 degrees, second level, 54 degrees, third level, 52 degrees, fourth level, 50 degrees, fifth level, 48 degrees, a 10-degree range across 5 levels, which represented only 2 degrees per level, far from the 12 degrees he'd calculated. Bruno Lang heard through other trappers that Leonhardt's structure was performing poorly. He rode out to see for himself, arriving on a December morning when surface temperature was 20 degrees. Leonhardt gave him a tour, showing him each level and explaining the temperature readings. Bruno's response was predictable. "You've got a 5-degree difference between your warmest and coldest rooms. That's not 12 degrees per level, Kurtz. That's your grand theory failing in practice. Come February, you'll be burning wood like the rest of us, trying to heat 5 chambers instead of 1. You've built the most inefficient cabin in Montana Territory." Leonhardt didn't defend himself. He simply explained that the earth was still holding summer warmth. The system needed deeper cold to function properly. Bruno laughed and rode off, spreading word that Kurtz's staircase was indeed a failure. Other trappers heard the reports. Ulrich Kessler stopped by and offered Leonhardt space in his own cabin for the winter. "No shame in admitting a mistake, boy. That structure might work come spring, when you don't need heating anyway. But it won't keep you alive this winter." Leonhardt declined politely. He maintained his fire, burned modest amounts of wood, and waited. He knew what the others didn't. The earth was his ally, not his enemy. Right now, the hillside was warm from summer. When winter truly arrived and froze the surface soil, the deeper earth would become his insulation, protecting his chambers from the full force of the cold. The system would work. It just needed the right conditions. December continued with mild temperatures. Leonhardt burned his fire, recorded his temperatures, and trusted his calculations. The real test was coming. December brought doubt. Leonhardt maintained his fire, burned modest amounts of wood, and recorded temperatures that refused to match his calculations. The gradient existed, but remained stubbornly shallow. 6 degrees separated the warmest level from the coolest. He had predicted 12 degrees per level, 60 degrees total range. Reality delivered barely more than 1 degree per level. He spent hours examining his vertical channels, wondering if he'd made them too small or too large. He checked his chinking for gaps that might be bleeding heat. He measured the dimensions of each chamber, verifying his calculations. Everything appeared correct on paper. The physics should work. But the temperatures told a different story. The problem haunted him during evening hours in the third level, where he spent most of his time. He'd built this entire structure based on principles he'd observed and measured. Earth maintained constant temperature underground. Heat rose naturally through air. Thermal mass stored and radiated warmth. These weren't theories. They were observable facts. Yet his structure wasn't performing as predicted. On December 15th, Leonhardt finally understood what was happening. He took his thermometer outside and measured the surface temperature of the hillside, 42 degrees. He climbed to the third level and pressed his hand against the exposed earth wall, noticeably warm. He climbed to the fifth level and did the same, still warm. The earth itself was the problem, or rather it wasn't yet the solution. The hillside had absorbed heat all through summer and fall. Months of warm weather had charged the thermal mass with warmth. That stored heat was now radiating into his chambers, but it was preventing the temperature gradient he needed. The earth was acting as a heater when he needed it to act as insulation. His structure required winter cold to function properly. The surface earth needed to freeze. The shallow soil needed to become an insulator rather than a heat source. Only then would the deeper earth, the clay surrounding his chambers 20 feet below the surface, provide the stable baseline temperature he'd calculated. That deeper earth would remain at 50-something degrees while surface temperatures plummeted. The contrast would create the gradient. Leonhardt realized he'd built a system that required specific conditions to function optimally. Those conditions didn't exist yet. He needed genuine winter, sustained cold that would transform his hillside from a warm mass into a cold shell with a warm core. He explained this to no one. The few trappers who asked about his structure received vague answers. He didn't want to give more ammunition to the skeptics who already considered him a fool. Bruno Lang had already spread word that the staircase was failing. Ulrich Kessler had offered rescue from Leonhardt's experiment gone wrong. Otto Zimmermann occasionally rode past, studying the structure with the satisfied expression of a man whose predictions were being confirmed. Leonhardt maintained his fire, used modest amounts of wood, and waited for real winter. His supplies were adequate. His firewood was sufficient. He could afford to wait while others assumed he was suffering. The structure would prove itself when conditions aligned. He just needed patience and the right weather. December continued with temperatures that rarely dropped below 20 degrees. Leonhardt burned his fire and trusted his calculations. The validation was coming. The cold front arrived on December 23rd. Temperature dropped from 30 degrees to 0 overnight. By the following morning, it had reached -15. The cold settled in with the weight of something permanent, transforming the landscape into a frozen stillness where even sound seemed to freeze. Leonhardt woke in the fifth level and immediately noticed a difference. The air felt warmer than previous nights, not dramatically warmer, but noticeably so. He climbed down to the fourth level, warmer still. By the time he reached the bottom level, the temperature difference was obvious. He retrieved his thermometer and began systematic measurements. Bottom level, near the fire, 62 degrees. Second level, 68 degrees. Third level, 76 degrees. Fourth level, 84 degrees. Fifth level, 92 degrees. He recorded the numbers twice to verify, unable to quite believe what he was seeing. 30 degrees of difference between bottom and top levels, 6 degrees per level on average. Not the 12 degrees per level he'd calculated, but far more than the 1 or 2 degrees he'd been seeing. And this was just the beginning. The Earth was still adjusting to the new surface conditions. Over the next week, Leonhardt watched the gradient strengthen. The surface of the hillside froze solid. Snow fell and accumulated, adding insulation. The temperature outside dropped to -20 and stayed there. Inside his structure, the thermal cascade intensified. By December 31st, his measurements showed a pattern that matched his calculations almost exactly. Bottom level, 58 degrees. Second level, 69 degrees. Third level, 81 degrees. Fourth level, 93 degrees. Fifth level, 104 degrees. 46 degrees of total range, 11 to 12 degrees per level. The system was working. The fifth level had become almost uncomfortably warm. Leonhardt moved his sleeping platform and found he could sleep without blankets, despite outside temperatures of -25. The earth above the chamber, now frozen on the surface but warm deeper down, acted as a perfect insulator. Heat, rising from below, had nowhere to go except into the chamber. The result was a room that maintained temperatures near body heat with no direct heating whatsoever. The third level, his primary living space, stayed at a comfortable 78 to 82 degrees, perfect for daily activities. He could work at his table, prepare food, perform tasks in shirt sleeves while outside the temperature threatened exposed skin with frostbite within minutes. The bottom level remained coolest but never dropped below 55 degrees even when the fire burned low overnight. The earth surrounding the foundation maintained its constant temperature, providing a baseline that prevented the chamber from freezing. Leonhardt's firewood consumption was remarkable. He burned approximately 4 split logs per day, roughly 1/5 what Johann and he had burned in their traditional cabin during the previous winter. The single fire at the base level provided adequate heat for 5 chambers, totaling nearly 600 square feet of living space. The system's efficiency came from multiple factors working together. Heat rose naturally through the vertical channels, requiring no fans or forced air. The Earth's thermal mass absorbed excess heat during the day and radiated it back at night, smoothing temperature fluctuations. The progressive insulation, each level more deeply buried than the last, meant the upper levels retained heat that would have escaped from a surface structure. Most importantly, Leonhardt was no longer fighting the full temperature differential between inside and outside. The earth surrounding his chambers maintained roughly 50 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. He only needed to add 30 degrees to reach comfort, not 70 or 80 degrees. The impossible was becoming routine. January of 1844 brought cold that broke records across Montana territory. Temperatures dropped to -30 on January 5th and stayed below -20 for 6 consecutive weeks. Wind made the air feel even colder, cutting through clothing and finding gaps in every structure. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried fences and blocked trails. Traditional cabins became desperate places. Men burned firewood at rates that depleted winter supplies by mid-January. Families faced impossible choices: burn furniture and floorboards or freeze. Some abandoned their cabins entirely, attempting dangerous journeys to settlements where they might find shelter. Bruno Lange's cabin was typical of the crisis. He'd stockpiled what he thought was adequate firewood, enough to last until March under normal conditions. By January 20th, he'd burned through 3/4 of his supply. His cabin, despite a fire burning constantly, maintained interior temperatures in the low 40s. His hands went numb while working inside. Ice formed on the interior walls near the door. He began burning everything combustible. His spare chair went into the fire. Wooden boxes that had held supplies, floorboards near the corners where he walked less frequently. The measures bought him days, not weeks. By early February, Bruno faced a stark reality. He would run out of fuel before winter ended. Ulrich Kessler's situation was worse. His larger cabin required more heat, and his advanced age made him more vulnerable to cold. His family huddled near the fireplace, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The children showed signs of frostbite on fingers and toes, despite never going outside. Ulrich's wife developed a persistent cough that worsened in the cold air. On February 8th, Ulrich made the decision to evacuate. He loaded his family onto a sled and headed for the nearest settlement, 40 miles distant. The journey took 5 days through brutal cold. 2 of his children suffered severe frostbite. His wife's cough turned to pneumonia. They survived, but barely. Otto Zimmermann fared slightly better due to his construction knowledge. His cabin was well built with tight chinking and good foundations. But even superior craftsmanship couldn't overcome the fundamental problem: 4 exposed walls, bleeding heat in all directions. He burned through his firewood supply by mid-February and began cutting green wood from frozen trees, wood that burned poorly and produced more smoke than heat. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Men who'd planned to winter in the mountains were abandoning their cabins. Those who stayed were burning through supplies at unsustainable rates. Several trappers were found dead in their cabins, frozen, despite evidence of fires that had burned until fuel ran out. The winter was killing people, not through dramatic disasters, but through simple mathematics. The cold was winning because traditional structures couldn't fight it efficiently. Every cabin built on the standard model was a losing battle against thermodynamics. Some men had more firewood than others, but everyone was fighting the same impossible fight. Meanwhile, smoke continued to rise from Leonhard Kurtz's hillside in a thin, steady column. Bruno Lang appeared at Leonhardt's structure on February 12th. He looked gaunt, his face showing the stress of 6 weeks fighting cold. He stood at the bottom-level entrance. Hesitant to knock, pride warring with desperation, Leonhardt opened the door before Bruno could decide. "Come in." Bruno entered the bottom chamber and stopped. The air was cool but not cold, perhaps 55 degrees, far warmer than outside's -28. More importantly, it was warmer than his own cabin, despite no visible fire in this level. "The fire's upstairs?" Bruno asked. "Bottom level. The heat rises." Leonhardt gestured toward the vertical channel in the ceiling. Bruno climbed to the second level and felt noticeably warmer air. Third level was comfortable enough that Leonhardt was working in a single shirt. Fourth level was warm. Fifth level made Bruno remove his heavy coat within seconds. The chamber felt like a summer afternoon. "How?" Bruno's voice carried disbelief. "It's -30 outside, and you're sleeping without blankets?" Leonhardt explained the system. Earth insulation, thermal mass, vertical heat distribution, 5 chambers creating a temperature gradient from a single fire. Bruno listened, his skepticism crumbling against the evidence of his own senses. "How much wood are you burning?" 4 to 5 logs daily. Bruno had been burning 20. The efficiency difference was staggering. Leonhardt's structure was heating 5 times the space using 1/4 the fuel. The mathematics were undeniable. Word spread quickly. Within 3 days, Otto Zimmermann arrived with a notebook. He spent 6 hours examining the structure, measuring chambers, studying the vertical channels, questioning Leonhardt about every detail. He took notes, with the focus of a man whose fundamental assumptions had been shattered. "The corner construction is standard," Otto observed. "The log work is good, but not revolutionary. The innovation is the hillside integration and the heat channels," Leonhardt confirmed. The individual techniques weren't complex. The genius was in the system, how earth, vertical space, and convection worked together. Ulrich Kessler arrived in late February after his family had recovered enough for him to travel. He climbed through all 5 levels silently, feeling the temperature increase, observing how comfortable the chambers were. At the top level, he sat on Leonhardt's sleeping platform and shook his head. "I called you a fool," Ulrich said quietly. "I'm the fool. You solved it. You actually solved winter." Other trappers came, some openly curious, some still skeptical despite the evidence. Leonhardt showed them everything. He explained the principles, shared his techniques, answered questions about construction details. He kept no secrets. The knowledge was free to anyone willing to learn. By March, 7 men had begun planning similar structures for the following summer. Otto Zimmermann had drawn detailed plans based on Leonhardt's design. Bruno Lang had selected a hillside site. Even the skeptics who didn't plan to build admitted the system worked. The crisis winter had provided the ultimate test. Traditional cabins had failed catastrophically. Leonhardt's terraced earth shelter had performed flawlessly. The validation was complete, undeniable, and measured in lives saved and resources conserved. The staircase to nowhere had become the solution to winter's oldest problem. Spring arrived in late April, melting snow and revealing the winter's toll. 3 trappers had died in their cabins. 7 families had abandoned the territory entirely, unwilling to face another winter. Those who remained understood they needed to change their approach or leave. Construction began in May. Otto Zimmermann built the first copy of Leonhardt's design 3 miles downstream. He modified details based on his carpentry experience but kept the core principles intact: 5 levels carved into a south-facing hillside, vertical heat channels, maximum earth contact. The structure took him all summer working alone. Bruno Lang started his version in June on a slope overlooking his trap lines. He made his chambers smaller than Leonhardt's, reasoning that less interior volume meant less space to heat. He added a 6th level at the top, pushing the concept further. Leonhardt visited and approved. The design was sound. By summer's end, 7 terraced earth shelters were under construction across the territory. Each builder adapted the concept to their site and needs. Some built 3 levels instead of 5. Others created larger chambers. One trapper built into a west-facing slope because that was all his land offered. The structures varied in details but shared fundamental DNA: earth insulation, vertical heat distribution, minimal exposed surface area. Leonhardt helped where asked but took no credit. When trappers thanked him for sharing the design, he redirected their gratitude. Johann Voigt's death taught me that traditional methods weren't enough. The structure should bear his name, not mine. The name didn't stick. Trappers called them terraced cabins or hillside shelters or simply earth houses. Some called them Kurtz shelters, despite Leonhardt's protests. The terminology mattered less than the adoption. Men were building structures that would keep them alive through winters that had previously killed. The winter of 1844 to 1845 tested the new structures. Otto Zimmermann reported his shelter performed exactly as Leonhardt's had: steady temperature gradient, minimal fuel consumption, comfortable living conditions despite brutal external cold. Bruno Lange's 6-level version created an even more dramatic gradient, with his top chamber reaching temperatures over 100 degrees. Not every builder succeeded perfectly. One trapper built on a north-facing slope and discovered his chambers stayed colder than expected. The lack of solar gain mattered more than he'd anticipated. Another made his vertical channels too large, allowing heat to rise too quickly without warming lower levels adequately. But even the imperfect versions outperformed traditional cabins substantially. By 1846, an estimated 20 terraced earth shelters existed across Montana Territory and into Wyoming. The design spread through word of mouth, carried by trappers who'd seen the structures firsthand. No formal plans existed. Men shared knowledge verbally and adapted it to their circumstances. Leonhardt left the mountains in 1847. The fur trade was dying, beaver populations depleted, fashion moving away from felt hats. He'd saved enough money to buy land in Oregon Territory. He married in 1848, started a family, and settled into farming life far from the wilderness that had nearly killed him. He never returned to Montana, never saw how his innovation continued spreading through frontier communities. Leonhardt Kurtz died in 1873 at age 62 on his Oregon homestead. His children knew he'd been a trapper once, but he rarely spoke of those years. The mountains were a previous life, disconnected from the farmer and family man they knew. His gravestone mentioned neither his trapping career nor the structures he'd built. In Montana, his original 5-tiered shelter continued serving occupants. A prospector claimed it in 1852 and lived there for 8 years. A homesteading family occupied it in the 1860s, making minor modifications but keeping the core structure intact. By 1870, it had become a way station for travelers, a known location where people could find reliable shelter. The design principles spread beyond their origin. Settlers moving into northern territories heard about earth shelters that stayed warm with almost no firewood. Homesteaders in Wyoming and Idaho built variations. The specific techniques evolved. Some builders used stone instead of logs for front walls. Others created different channel systems. But the fundamental insight persisted, building into earth instead of on top of it. Using vertical space to distribute heat. Letting convection do the work instead of fighting it. Military frontier posts adopted modified versions for critical structures. A fort in Dakota Territory built an earth-sheltered magazine that maintained stable temperature year-round, protecting powder stores from moisture and temperature extremes. A trading post in Wyoming constructed living quarters using terraced earth methods, reducing firewood requirements by 70%. Modern historians estimate the design and its variations saved 40 to 60 lives over the following 3 decades. The exact number is impossible to verify because survival often goes unrecorded, but accounts from the period reference earth houses, allowing people to winter in locations where traditional cabins would have meant death. The phrase, "built like a Kurtz shelter," appeared in several letters and journals from the 1850s and 60s, signifying construction that could withstand extreme conditions. Most people using the phrase didn't know who Kurtz was. The name had become separated from the man, transformed into generic terminology. Leonhardt never knew his innovation's full impact. He died believing he'd built one successful structure that a handful of trappers had copied. He didn't know about the military applications, the homesteader adaptations, the lives saved in winters he never witnessed. His legacy existed in structures scattered across the northern frontier, most built by men who'd never met him. The original structure stands today, weathered but intact. The logs have grayed, the chinking has required replacement, but the fundamental design remains sound after nearly 2 centuries. Modern visitors find it remarkable, a frontier innovation that solved winter through understanding rather than force, through working with nature instead of fighting it. The story teaches a simple truth. The most valuable innovations often aren't new inventions, but better applications of existing principles. Leonhard Kurtz didn't discover thermal mass or convection. He simply recognized that frontier construction ignored both, and he built a structure that didn't. His solution required no advanced technology, just careful thought and willingness to build differently than everyone else. The impossible had become routine. A structure heating 5 chambers from a single fire wasn't magic. It was physics applied intelligently, and that solution, shared freely and adapted widely, changed how people survived in one of the harshest environments on the American frontier.